Welcome to Under the Rug at Work, where I shine light on things that are normally swept under the rug. Today, I'm chatting with Clare Edwards about unconscious bias. Now, Claire's a speaker, facilitator, and coach, and the founder of Brain Smart People Development. Thank you so much for joining me, Claire. I'm really excited about this topic because it's something that we're very unconscious of.
Thank you, Nicole. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's time to make the unconscious conscious.
Definitely. But before we get stuck into that, can you share a little bit about your background and experience for people who might not have met you before?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Obviously, you'll hear from my accent that I'm originally from the UK. And this month, on the 22nd of December, I'll have been in Australia for 20 years.
Wow.
So my background was originally 10 years in hospitality, and then I was able to springboard from hospitality into IT. And it was one of my roles was as in corporate development with an internet company. And then we sort of rode that roller coaster of just expanding, 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 and then we collapsed.
Ah,
And I was running a call center and I had 120 staff. And then in a very short period of time, I had to reduce that number of staff by 70. And it was that whole process of coaching people through the redundancy and helping them to see the light at the end of the tunnel that I then made the decision to leave corporate because what I realized, what sort of made my heart sing, was helping people through change.
yeah.
And I think that the lens, the filter of everything that I do is unpaining change. I think we too often have to suffer through change, and it's not necessary. So
Yeah.
that's what gets me jumping out of bed every morning.
That's so great. And uh, we are so aligned in so many ways. And the fact that, you and I both started a business because we saw things that
Yeah,
would be done better and we
yeah.
really want to support people. So I love that about you. And change is really difficult to manage. People are so different. And then you bring unconscious bias into it. That just,
Oh, yes. I love that saying that change is like wrestling jelly.
yep. So people should really reach out for help with these kind of things, but we're always so busy and there's so much change happening. I
Yeah.
remember, back in the day when you would have a change program and it's like, right, something big is going to happen. How can we work together with an expert like yourself? But it's almost like every day is a new change program and nothing stays still. So it can be overwhelming and unmanageable. So having someone like you, being an expert in that area is fantastic. But the unconscious bias that,
Mm,
well, many of them that we all have, is it just adds that additional layer of complexity to every
yeah,
individual person, right?
yeah.
Um, can you maybe explain, what our unconscious biases are and what are some of the most common ones that you see in the workplace?
Yeah, great. And I think it's a really important place to start because if we look at what we call cognitive bias, there's over 180. And if we look at unconscious bias, we're talking about 20. So what I have tried to do and using models from the Neuro Leadership Institute. So I'm coming to this through a neuroscience lens. Basically, unconscious bias are decisions that or they're shortcuts that we make that can help our decision making, but can result in exclusion.
Yeah.
So they're exactly that. We aren't conscious in the moment when we're making that decision or we're making that judgment. We are not consciously aware of the bias that's in there. And often these shortcuts that we make, these judgments that we make, stem from our conditioning. There's lots and lots and lots of different sources. But basically, it is classic. I know it's cliche, but if you have a brain, you're biased. So I think the first thing to is acknowledge that you, I, and every other person on this planet is biased.
Yeah. And it's really a protective mechanism, right? It's how we grew up and how we what grew up is in the evolutionary
Yeah,
state, to know if someone's a threat or not. And we just
yeah,
have different perceived or actual threats in the workplaces, which is where
yeah.
psychosocial safety comes into it, and which is where we connected. Um, but it's not always a bad thing. But definitely in the workplace, we have to know what it is. So what are some of the common ones that you
Yeah.
see at work?
And I'm glad that you said that it's not necessarily a bad thing. If we think about it as neutral, then we don't have to label. So the five that I sort of focus on, I've used an acronym called SPEAR. So we need to spearhead looking at unconscious bias in the workplace, and it's everybody's role. It's not just leadership. So the first two you'll be really familiar with, and maybe later on we focus more on the other three. The first two, the first one is similarity. And exactly what you said, it's I prefer people who are similar to me because they make me feel safe.
Mhm.
So our evolution is the assumption is foe before friend.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be wary of you. And you can even see this um maybe not in babies, but when children start to getting to that toddler age and you approach them and they're sort of
Yeah.
wary of that. So it's ingrained. So that's similarity bias. And it even goes as far as to say, not only do I prefer people like me, but people like me are better than people who aren't like me. That's
Mm,
unconscious judgment.
yeah.
Okay, so we're not looking at conscious prejudice. The P is perception. So it's around stereotyping. Our brains love to group and categorize. And so we will naturally unconsciously stereotype.
Hmm.
The E is for experience. We make these grand assumptions that other people think like us
Yes.
and that we are right. Um, and it feels good to be right. Every time we're right, we
Yep.
get a little hit of dopamine. So,
Yeah.
we just and so we make these grand assumptions that anyone who is in any way similar to us will also think like us. And then we're confused when we get a different response.
Mm,
That's the E. The A is availability bias. So we take these shortcuts and we will make decisions based on the most available information. And thinking about this, Nicole, we've got new terms in the dictionary: infoxication, infobesity. We are bombarded with information. We're consuming, but we're not digesting. So,
yes.
and all of these will have impacts in the workplace, which we can maybe go on to. And the last one is risk, because we have our safety bias, our negativity bias
Mm.
is 5 to 1. So we have 5 times more neurons in our brain dedicated to looking for danger and keeping us safe than to looking for pleasure. So that risk bias is that we are reluctant to let go of something that we've invested in. And thinking about that from a workplace perspective, that can cost us a lot of money.
Yes, the way we've always done things around here. And it creates conflict and challenges because, as you said, we expect people to think and act like us, but then you've got other people who are thinking that way, and saying, well, you shouldn't discriminate based on this, or you shouldn't have those biases, or you shouldn't have those stereotypes and
Yeah,
assumptions. But it's like, putting on your clothes of a morning, you always do it with one hand and one arm first. So it's like saying, don't do it that way. That's the wrong way, and undo it. It's very
yeah,
unnatural because we're not aware of it. It's just something that we do. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think what we're looking at is to say, let's take blame out of this.
Yes.
We and bias is what we call unidirectional. If we're looking at sort of those typical demographics of bias around gender and age and ethnicity and what have you, is just because I may be in a minority and I am perceiving bias from somebody else, doesn't mean to say that I'm not biased back, because we all have bias. So it's about, how do we bring this to the surface in a non-blaming way, where it's everybody's role, not just the role of leadership,
Yes.
and also looking at changing in a way the paradigm that if you've got an organization where the diversity and inclusion strategy sits in one area of the business, or there's a head of diversity and inclusion, or it's around leadership. Ironically, it's excluding the people who are on the receiving end of bias, because it's their job and not everybody's job.
Yes.
Isn't that ironic?
It is, and I feel like a lot of the programs, not just this, but any program that is developed, even, a change program, focuses on one particular thing, but doesn't focus on the outcome. So instead of saying what result do we want, they create a program based on the thing, and sometimes the result is forgotten and we don't end up getting there. We create a lot of movement and traction to say that we're checking these boxes. I mean, I see it when I come to psychosocial safety all the time. What are the hazards? Check the boxes. But what outcome do you want and how do you get there? So yeah, it's about the focusing on the right thing, right?
Absolutely. 100%.
And what I'm hearing you say a lot is around inclusion. So not excluding different people or other areas, but what is the impact of inclusion?
Yeah. And there's a lovely saying actually by a guy called Joe Gestant, who says, if you don't deliberately and intentionally include, you will unintentionally exclude. So it's looking at each of these biases through the frame of inclusion. So I'm going to put similarity bias to one side, because I think people are very, very familiar with it. They understand, the impact of treating people who are differently to us differently. And we know from research in neuroscience that diverse teams perform better, but are more uncomfortable. So it's that act of inclusion, that proactive act of inclusion, that the process of inclusion is only one part, but managing inclusion is another thing altogether. But if we take, I'm going to take sort of the EAR bit from SPEAR, given the time that we've got. So if we look at the experience bias, where we think that people, think and act like us. If you're someone who's heading up a change initiative, a transformation initiative, and we go in through the lens of our own experience, how many times have you experienced, or I've experienced, or our listeners have experienced, a change that is communicated, and we have the assumption that it's going to land brilliantly, everyone's going to be on board, and we, as the instigators, are surprised at the response that we get. And it's like, who do they think they're talking to? Who did they run this by? Oh my, we've been there, we've done that. And so the inclusion around experience. So if we're looking to mitigate, we can't rid ourselves of bias. It's not possible, but we can mitigate, and we can put systems in place. So classically, with an experience bias, we're looking at the first pillar of human-centered design is empathy. So the first thing that we do when we're looking to engage people in change is to put ourselves in their shoes. I'm no longer the CEO, I'm no longer the ambassador, the change champion, what have you. I am the person who, for example, has been the subject matter expert on this particular system for the last 10 years. I am now terrified, absolutely terrified of this new system. If
Yeah.
I don't have psychological safety in my organization, I'm either not going to speak up or I'm going to walk away.
Yeah.
And you've lost really, really good people.
Yeah.
So it's about, it's about that check-in and really importantly, giving other people permission to challenge us
Yes.
every time, to be open to that, using that emotional intelligence and saying, okay, this is what we're looking to do. Let's have a look at the consequences, the impact, the what ifs.
Mm-hmm.
I am now Joe or Kim in, accounts payable. What am I thinking? What's going through my head? What are my fears? What are my concerns?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to put my experience to one side and put myself in their shoes. But there has to be the psychological safety, which,
Yes.
which is where you come in, for somebody to be able to challenge that CEO or that ambassador or that change champion, say, can we just do a check-in here with with our messaging? And who have we included? Who have we consulted to make sure that this thing lands well? So that's on
Yeah.
the experience side.
Yeah.
On the availability side, um, one of the ways that it can exclude is, I'll just give you an example. Somebody, you're putting a report together. Maybe you're putting board papers together or something like that, and you've done a little bit of research, and you've already and it sort of comes together with confirmation bias, because you're going to put what you believe in this
Yeah.
report.
Yeah.
Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, Nicole, I've just found this new information. It actually sort of contradicts what you're saying here for the board papers, but I think it's really important. And you say, yes, sure, no problem.
Mm.
You've just excluded that person's contribution
Mm.
to your work.
Yeah.
So, and there's and it comes from Daniel Kahneman, wonderful, wonderful guy who passed earlier this year or last year, where he uses a metaphor. It's not real, it's not neurobiological, but he uses a metaphor of system 1 and system 2. So if I ask you, Nicole, what's 2 2s?
4.
What's 4 4s?
16.
What's 16 16s?
Is it 132? I have to let me get a calculator.
You just demonstrated it beautifully.
Oh,
Whatever.
really?
Yes, because those first two, that was how we learned our times table. It's raw.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the second one is, oh, hang on a minute here. I have to work a little bit harder. And our brains are lazy.
Yeah.
So we'll go for the and what the thing is about unconscious bias is it's error prone.
Mm.
So we might go for the most recent information, but it might not be accurate. And there may be consequences for that.
Mm.
And then again, with the risk based, for example, you've invested in a project. You've invested a lot of money, a lot of money, a lot of energy, a lot of time into this project. And things are not working out the way that they should be. And you suspect that you're not going to get the return on investment. And there are a lot of drivers around this. In this one, it could be status oriented. You may be the owner of that project.
Mm-hmm.
And the success of this project rests with you and your sense of importance, and you're reluctant to give it up. But what about all the other people it's impacting? You're forging ahead regardless,
Mm.
because you don't want to lose face, or you're scared of that loss. Meanwhile, there's chaos abounds. So the exclusion can take many, many forms. And it's about how do we expand our thinking to firstly understand these layers of bias
Mm.
and bring them into conscious awareness, be open and willing to talk about them, have that psychological safety, and say, okay, what are some of the things that we can do to mitigate them?
Yeah. And I suppose you've mentioned a couple of really good things there that I'd love to dive into a little bit more. We kind of have had a little bit of a chat about this, but you've said you can't get rid
Yeah.
of our bias. So can you maybe explain
Yeah.
on top of that why
Yeah.
we can't, and maybe how can we reduce or mitigate them in the workplace if we
Lovely.
can't rid of them?
Great question. So the reason we can't get rid of our biases is that when we are making a decision in the moment, our brain cannot determine whether that decision is biased or not. It's
Mm,
just making a decision based on whatever information happens to be available, whatever emotional state we happen to be in, and we're not aware of it. So there's a couple of things. We can see bias in hindsight.
mm,
So reflection is critical, absolutely critical. And more, I think, in this fast-paced, information-rich digital world that we're in, we are overlooking reflection as an extremely powerful tool. So we can see bias in hindsight.
yeah.
Other people can see bias in us. So that permission to challenge. We
Mm,
had, and before it was known as unconscious bias, I worked in an executive leadership team for an IT research company, and our finance director was absolutely brilliant. He was very risk averse, and we'd be constantly having these to and fro's and negotiation and influence and what have you, and it was exhausting. And eventually Simon said, look, I am really risk averse. Um, so let's cut to the chase
mm,
and let's stop doing all this dancing and toing and froing and dallying and just challenge me.
mm,
And I may push back on you, but and so that was he was declaring his bias.
yeah.
If you're aware of a bias, declare it. You know, for me, it's I know availability bias is really strong with me. I'm time poor and I'll just go with whatever I have. And then I have a group, I belong to a mastermind group. I have a group of peers
Mhm.
who, if there's something important, I can say, hey, Bob, hey, Adrian, hey, Will, can I run this past you? And they will challenge me.
Yeah.
And it's refreshing, but you have to be prepared to be wrong.
Yes.
Um,
And it's okay to be wrong.
and it's fine to be wrong. It's perfectly fine. It's called being human.
Yes.
And so systems and processes. So we're aware, if we go back to similarity bias, for example, where we may or may not be aware of systems and processes that can help us, say, in the hiring, in recruitment and hiring.
Mhm.
So we take names and genders off resumes. We take
Mm,
tertiary education off a resume. We reflect on, for example, the necessary requirements of a role, because they
mm,
can be exclusionary. They can exclude refugees, they can exclude migrants, they can exclude people with disabilities. So we've got systems. There's, programs like Textio and different systems that we can run adverts and resumes through, and it will pick out bias.
mm.
The problem is that sometimes the people who coded those systems were men, middle-aged, intelligent coders who are men. So you can't get away from it. You can't get away from it. But there are other systems, and when there's a program that I run called Harnessing Team Diversity and Inclusion, and we talk about reflection when we're having team meetings, is whenever there's a decision made in a team meeting, we're noting down those decisions. And then at the end, we say, okay, let's look at this through a diversity lens. Let's look at it through an inclusion lens.
Mm,
Where is there bias in this decision?
mm.
And if we're all willing to be wrong, it's an easier process. We
Yes.
don't have to hold on to it. You're challenging I made that decision, you're challenging my decision. No, we're doing it for the benefit of the organization. We're going
Yes.
to save time, we're going to save money, we're going to increase quality, we're going to improve inclusion. Um,
Yes.
and it's about having the discipline and creating a habit of reflection, a habit of looking at something through a bias lens.
Mm.
And also, when I'm running unconscious bias programs, it's after every area that we look at, after each of the 5 biases, we do a reflection exercise. And, and I have to set the psychologically safe environment at the beginning to say, okay, Nicole, you've just heard from Angelique, what that is. What do you see in there? What bias do you see?
Mm.
And we cross-reference. And
Mm.
it's uncomfortable. It's often uncomfortable, but by the end of it, it's like, whoa, okay. And
Yeah.
that's when the hard work starts. So I hope that's gone some way to give you an idea of areas for mitigation. It has to come down to systems and
Yeah.
processes,
Yeah.
because in the moment our brain cannot differentiate between a decision that's biased or unbiased.
Yeah. There are so many juicy bits in what you've just said. I'm actually looking forward to re-listening to this. But one of the things that I like to share as well is looking at being wrong as a good thing. Because
Hmm.
if we can find out in the initial conversations or
Yeah,
in the initial workings or even, far down the track that we may be wrong in particular areas, then we can make it better. It's not about you're wrong,
yeah,
it's about how can we improve on this? How can we work together
yeah.
to make something great rather than individual pieces of people wanting to do their right bit? It's, yeah, really pulling that together.
Absolutely. And there's a number of things in there. If we go back to the neuroscience of it,
Mm.
think back to when you were at school and you submitted your homework and you got it back. What were some of the things that you saw on your homework that either made you smile or made you sad? It's a question.
You get the red marks to say you're wrong here, and then you get the green ticks or the red ticks to say this is the good stuff, right? But often
Absolutely.
not explanation around it either.
No,
Mm.
no. So it's a conditioning from very, very early on that every time you saw that green tick, again, you had a little bit of dopamine, and dopamine is a hormone of motivation that makes you want to repeat the process. But
Mm.
every time you got that red cross, you got a little hit of cortisol or adrenaline that made you feel icky and
Yeah.
sad, and you didn't want to repeat it. So it's how do we reframe the labeling of right and wrong? And maybe one idea is into learnings. What are our learnings from this? What have we learned that we'd like to repeat? What have we learned that we could change, and why?
Mm.
And why?
Yes.
So getting into that sense of reasoning and meaning and purpose. But you think about this culturally, Nicole, that's a big change, a psychological change, a mindset change, a conditioning change.
Mm.
But someone like, Satya Nadella from Microsoft, he's done that. He's turned Microsoft into a learning growth mindset organization where there is no right or wrong,
Yes.
where there's learnings, lessons, love
Yes.
for what you do, love for stuffing up.
Yes. Lots of organizations talk about failing fast and failure is okay, but then they don't make it acceptable. So
No,
really
no,
need to
they don't.
go through.
They don't. And when somebody um, you know, makes a mistake, fails, and then they're castigated for it, or they're excluded for it, they're not chosen next time for that project,
Mm.
then it's exclusionary. It's going to impact on their engagement. They'll probably leave. You've lost good people. There are gaps in inclusive management practices. There's a whole ripple effect.
Yeah, there is. And honestly, we could talk for hours about this. Maybe let's do that. We'll have another pod next year.
Great.
But I find one of the big things that people would struggle with is actually calling out
Yeah.
biases. So, can you give maybe some tips or tricks or advice or suggestions on how we can do that in a safe way to understand what it is and be able to move forward, be able to reframe and change that I'm wrong to how it's better?
Fantastic. Okay, so there is, I think, if we're looking at the nuance of language, it's about if we're on the receiving end, we're sensing bias, we're perceiving bias.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be that, remember, bias is unconscious. It may not be that the person saying that statement is actually biased.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things, and I'll actually encourage your listeners and readers, if there's something that I love this book. It is extremely rich. I could read it 5 or 10 times, but it's by Buki Masako, and it's called I Don't Understand. And he uses this methodology for two different types of bias. So let's take a simple bias, which might, or simple perceived bias, that somebody for whom English is a second language,
Mm-hmm.
and the other person says to them, "Oh, you speak so well."
Yep.
Now, they might be just complimenting that person. You
Mm-hmm.
speak so well in comparison to somebody else I've just heard, or what have you. I don't know.
Yep.
The person on the receiving end may be thinking, what do you mean I speak so well? I speak so well for what? I speak so well for someone who doesn't have English as a first language.
Mm-hmm.
I speak so well because of my socioeconomic background. So what Buki suggests is for the person who is sensing the bias, the receiver, is to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yes.
Because if that person was genuinely complimenting and
Mm.
this person is like, what do you mean? Then this ends up being reverse bias. They're being biased towards the giver of the compliment.
Yes.
So they're saying, and then what we can do, and this is simple bias, or what we, so they're called microaggressions. You speak so well, or for me, I'm 4'10 3/4. I get, what's the weather like down there? Okay. And there's a way that you can respond, and Bookie calls it reconditioning. You can
Mm-hmm.
use humor, but you don't use aggression, you don't use passive aggression. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, with me being really short, and they say, "Oh, what's the weather like down there?" And I say, "I reckon it's the same as the weather up there."
Yeah.
And you move on. You
Yeah.
move on. It's not a battle worth facing. So for this one, oh, you speak really well. The person can come back with and say, "Thank you," and so do you,
Yes.
and move on.
Yes.
If it's a more complex issue, say it's you've applied for a promotion, you've applied for a role, and you're
Mm-hmm.
a pool of 4 people,
Mm-hmm.
and you're in a minority, and the other 3 people are in the majority.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's more of a system of, he says, step one is check your own mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Leave your luggage in the lobby. Have an open mind and give the people the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
But then you can start to ask questions, and you just say, when it came to that promotion or what have you, and I was unsuccessful, I don't understand.
Mm.
And
Yep.
your tonality is, I don't understand, is a question.
Yep.
It's a curiosity. And when we ask a question out of curiosity, the other person will want to respond. They might
Mm.
come back with, what do you mean I don't understand? Or they can say, okay, yeah, what is it that you don't understand? Or they might go straight into explaining the reasons for the decision.
Mm.
But where he calls it dispassionate developmental inquiry, it's
Mm.
coming in with curiosity and saying, help me to understand the reasons behind this decision making.
Yes.
Because my current lens is, I was not chosen for that promotion because I'm a woman, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm in my 50s, because I have a hearing impairment, because I have an ethnic background, because I have an accent, what have you.
Mm.
And then a collaborative, equal exchange comes in where that person then divulges that it was experience related,
Yes.
or that the other person genuinely did have more experience in a particular area. So
Mm.
we have to, each and every one of us, take the chips off our shoulders, embrace curiosity. But the most important thing is that we don't stay quiet. He calls
Yeah.
that calling in bias. We have to call bias out with an attitude of open-mindedness, of curiosity, of and this happened to me when in COVID, I
Mm.
started to apply for jobs. As you know, the work that we do,
Mm.
March 2020 disappeared completely. And
Yeah.
I was applying for jobs that, according to LinkedIn, I had 100% of the requirements.
Yeah.
And I wasn't getting selected for interview. And
Mm.
in all my wisdom of what I do, I knew that it was because of my age. I
Mm.
knew that. Hello. I knew nothing. I
Mm.
knew nothing. But we tell ourselves stories because it makes us feel a little bit better.
Yes. I've heard those stories. And just going back to your you speak well compliment. If I was able to speak another language and someone said that's really great, I would be really chuffed by that. Because it's so hard to speak a second language.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, that's what I think
yeah.
because I can't do it.
And let me give you another example. So, um, I when I'm speaking, say I get into an Uber or I'm chatting with people,
Mm.
I am naturally curious. I speak a few languages. I love languages.
Yeah.
And I try and guess where people are from. So
Mhm.
I'll say, "Oh, where's that interesting accent from?" Or I might say, "Oh, I'm detecting maybe Zimbabwe rather than South Africa." For
Mhm.
me, I'm genuinely curious.
Yes.
But I've not used my skills of empathy to go into the shoes of someone who may have fled Zimbabwe, for example.
Yes.
Maybe even the word triggers something for them. So
Mm.
I think there's a couple of things. There's for the person on the receiving end, to notice my genuine curiosity
Mm.
rather than me, so where are you really from?
Mm.
That's not where I'm coming from. But if that person suspects that there might be some sort of bias in there, to say, oh, that's an interesting question. I'm from Sydney.
Yeah.
I'm from Madawi.
Yeah.
Or are you curious to know where I was born? But then we've got a lot of people, who look different from us white Anglo-Saxon people who
Mm.
were born here. It can be a bit of a minefield, but we don't want to sort of jump into the field of political correctness and
Yes.
just say, let's always assume positive intent.
Yes. Because 99% of the time that's the case. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, I have loved this chat, Claire, and I'm sure the listeners will have as well. So, where's the best place that they can connect with you and find out more and follow your work?
Fantastic. So, LinkedIn is the best place to interact with me.
Mhm.
My website is brain-smart.com, and they're
Mhm.
probably the best two avenues.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this chat. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to our next one.
Fantastic. I know it's a lot to unpack in a short time. And I know sometimes I speak quite quickly, so maybe people can play it back a little bit more slowly.
Oh, I loved it.
That's about it.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Go well, Nicole.